What if I told you that a family of 4 vanished without a trace in America's most visited national park, and the only clue to their fate was discovered a decade later by a park ranger who wasn't even looking for them? What if I told you that this clue, a simple child's toy, would raise more questions than it answered, and that to this day, no one knows what really happened to the Carters during their summer vacation in 1993? This is the story of Michael Carter, his wife Sarah, their 8-year-old daughter Emma, and 6-year-old son Tommy. A story that begins with a dream vacation and ends with one of the most puzzling disappearances in Yellowstone's history. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about missing persons cases. I've spent years investigating unexplained disappearances, but the Carter family case still haunts me. It was July 15th, 1993, when Michael Carter pulled their blue Chevy Suburban into the parking lot of the Old Faithful Inn. Sarah sat beside him, a map of Yellowstone spread across her lap, already planning their week-long adventure. In the back seat, Emma clutched her beloved pink teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, while Tommy pressed his face against the window, mesmerized by the otherworldly landscape surrounding them. The Carters weren't your typical tourists. Michael worked as a geologist for a mining company in Denver, and this trip had been planned for months. Sarah had homeschooled both children, and she saw Yellowstone as the perfect outdoor classroom. Emma was fascinated by wildlife, already carrying a junior ranger notebook she'd bought at the gift shop. Tommy loved rocks and kept a small collection in his backpack, each specimen carefully labeled in his 6-year-old handwriting. They checked into cabin 127 at the Old Faithful Lodge cabins around 3 p.m. that Thursday. The cabin was modest but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchenette, and a front porch that faced directly toward the famous geyser. The registration clerk, Maria Gonzalez, would later tell investigators that the family seemed excited and normal. Emma asked her about the best spots to see bears, while Tommy wanted to know if there were really underground rivers beneath the park. That evening, they attended the evening ranger program about geothermal features. Ranger Tom Mitchell, who presented that night, remembered the family clearly. Michael asked informed questions about mineral deposits, while Sarah took detailed notes for their homeschool curriculum. Emma raised her hand multiple times, asking about animal behavior, and Tommy sat quietly but attentively, occasionally whispering questions to his father. After the program, the family walked back to their cabin as darkness fell. Other guests saw them on the path around 9:30 p.m. Emma was still carrying Mr. Buttons, and Tommy was collecting small stones along the walkway, despite the dim lighting. They seemed like any other family enjoying their first night in one of America's most beautiful places. Nobody could have predicted that this would be the last time anyone would see them alive, or so we thought. The cabin's porch light was still on when the night security guard made his rounds at 11 p.m. Through the window, he could see the family inside, the parents on the small couch, the children getting ready for bed. Everything appeared completely normal. The next morning would shatter that illusion and launch one of the most intensive search operations in Yellowstone's history. But what investigators would discover, or rather, what they wouldn't discover, would defy all logic and haunt everyone involved for years to come. Friday morning, July 16th, started like any other day in Yellowstone. The sun rose over the Grand Loop Road, tourists began emerging from their cabins and hotels, and the park prepared for another busy summer day. But at 11 a.m., when the housekeeping staff knocked on cabin 127's door for their scheduled cleaning, no one answered. Maria Gonzalez, the same clerk who had checked them in, was called to investigate. What she found defied explanation. The cabin door was unlocked, not unusual for families planning to return soon. Inside, the beds were unmade, but didn't appear to have been slept in. Emma's pink teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, lay on the kitchen table next to an unfinished game of cards. Tommy's rock collection was scattered across the floor near his small backpack, as if he'd been showing the specimens to someone. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the counter, the bread still soft, suggesting it had been abandoned recently. But here's where it gets strange. All of the family's belongings were still in the cabin. Michael's wallet lay on the dresser with $347 in cash and all his credit cards. Sarah's purse contained her identification, car keys, and even her prescription medication that she took daily for a heart condition. The children's clothes were neatly folded in their suitcase, and Emma's junior ranger notebook was open to a page where she'd started drawing a picture of Old Faithful, the crayon still resting in the book's crease. Most puzzling of all was their blue Chevy Suburban. It sat in the exact same parking spot where they'd left it the day before, doors locked, keys nowhere to be found. The vehicle showed no signs of damage or struggle. Inside, investigators found camping gear for their planned hiking trips, a cooler still containing lunch for 4 people, and a road atlas with their intended route through the park marked in red ink. Tommy's booster seat was properly installed, and Emma's favorite book was tucked into the seat pocket. Park Ranger Tom Mitchell was called to the scene around noon. He'd been with Yellowstone for 15 years and had dealt with missing tourists before, but this felt different. Usually, when families go missing, we find some kind of trail, footprints, disturbed vegetation, something that tells us which direction they went, he told me years later. With the Carters, it was like they simply evaporated. The immediate response was swift and comprehensive. Within hours, search and rescue teams were deployed across the area. Ranger stations throughout the park received descriptions and photographs of all 4 family members. The families' faces were broadcast on local news stations, and missing person flyers were distributed to every business and lodge within a 50-mile radius. Michael Carter, 6'2", brown hair, wearing a red flannel shirt and blue jeans. Sarah Carter, 5'6", blonde hair, last seen in a yellow jacket and hiking boots. Emma Carter, 4'3", brown hair in pigtails, pink jacket. Tommy Carter, 3'8", blonde hair, blue jacket with dinosaurs on it. The search for the Carter family became one of the largest operations in Yellowstone's history. By Saturday morning, July 17th, over 200 people were involved in the effort. Park rangers, local law enforcement, volunteers, and even specialized tracking dogs combed every inch of the area surrounding Old Faithful. They searched hiking trails, thermal features, campgrounds, and remote wilderness areas where the family might have wandered. Search dogs were brought in from 3 different states. These weren't ordinary pets. They were highly trained tracking animals, capable of following human scent trails that were days old. The handlers started at cabin 127, allowing the dogs to smell the family's belongings before beginning their search. But something unprecedented happened. The dogs showed interest in the cabin's interior, but seemed confused once they reached the front porch. They would circle the area, whine, and then lose the trail completely. It was as if the family's scent simply vanished at the cabin's doorstep. Helicopter searches covered hundreds of square miles of wilderness. Thermal imaging cameras scanned for heat signatures that might indicate people in distress. Ground teams checked every cave, every thermal pool, every possible place where 4 people might take shelter or become trapped. They found nothing. No footprints leading away from the cabin, no torn clothing caught on branches, no signs of struggle anywhere in the surrounding area. The investigation expanded beyond the park boundaries. FBI agents interviewed the hotel staff, other guests who had stayed nearby, and anyone who might have seen the family after Thursday evening. They examined the family's credit card records, phone records, and background for any indication of why they might have disappeared voluntarily. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. Michael and Sarah Carter had no financial problems, no marital issues, no enemies or legal troubles. Their bank account showed normal activity up until their Yellowstone trip. Michael's employer confirmed he was in good standing at work and had been looking forward to the vacation for months. Sarah's sister in Minnesota said she'd spoken to Sarah on Wednesday night, just before they left for Yellowstone, and everything seemed perfectly normal. The children were happy, healthy, and excited about their trip. As days turned into weeks, the search area expanded exponentially. Teams checked abandoned mining shafts, remote hot springs, and areas of the park that most tourists never see. They dragged several lakes and ponds. Investigators contacted every hospital, morgue, and police department within a 5-state radius. The case was featured on national news programs, and tips poured in from across the country. None led anywhere. The strangest aspect of the investigation was the complete absence of any physical evidence. In most missing persons cases, even when bodies are never found, investigators discover some trace of the victim's final movements. A dropped piece of clothing, disturbed soil, broken branches where someone passed through dense vegetation, anything that provides a clue about what happened. With the Carters, there was nothing. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist the moment they walked into that cabin on Thursday night. By September 1993, the intensive search had been scaled back, but the case remained active. Park rangers continued to keep an eye out for any sign of the family during their regular patrols. The cabin where the Carters had stayed was processed multiple times by different forensic teams, but it yielded no useful evidence. Eventually, it was returned to service, though many staff members reported feeling uneasy about renting it to other families. The case attracted attention from paranormal investigators and conspiracy theorists. Some suggested the family had encountered something supernatural in the geothermal landscape of Yellowstone. Others proposed more elaborate theories involving government cover-ups or alien abductions. Park officials dismissed these theories, but they couldn't provide any rational explanation for what had happened to the Carters. Michael's brother David Carter arrived from Philadelphia to help with the search and to handle the family's affairs. He was a skeptical, practical man who worked as an accountant, but even he began to question everything he thought he knew about reality. "I've gone through every possibility 1,000 times," he told investigators. Michael wasn't the type to just disappear. Sarah was incredibly responsible. They would never have put their children in danger. Something happened to them, but I can't understand what it could have been. The children's disappearance was particularly hard for the community to accept. Emma's Junior Ranger notebook became a symbol of the case's heartbreaking nature. The unfinished drawing of Old Faithful, with its carefully drawn geyser and surrounding trees, was reproduced in newspapers and missing persons flyers. Tommy's scattered rock collection was photographed and documented, each small stone labeled with his neat printing. Quartz from Colorado, pretty red rock, sparkly one for Emma. As winter approached, the search efforts became even more challenging. Snow began falling in October, covering any potential evidence that might have been missed during the summer and fall searches. The case officially transitioned from a rescue operation to a recovery mission, though no one wanted to admit that hope was fading. Local media continued to cover the story, especially around holidays when families typically gather together. Christmas 1993 was particularly difficult for the extended Carter family. Sarah's sister held a memorial service in Minnesota, though it felt strange to mourn people who might still be alive somewhere. Michael's parents refused to accept that their son and his family were gone, maintaining their house exactly as it had been when the Carters left for Yellowstone. The case file grew thicker as investigators pursued every possible lead. Psychics contacted law enforcement, claiming to have visions of the family's location. Amateur detectives sent detailed theories about what might have happened. None of these efforts produced any tangible results, but they demonstrated how deeply the case had affected people who had never even met the Carters. The years passed slowly for everyone connected to the Carter family disappearance. 1994, 1995, 1996. Each year brought new hope that someone might find something, anything, that would explain what had happened. The case was featured periodically on television shows about unsolved mysteries, generating new tips and renewed search efforts, But the outcome was always the same. Nothing. Park Ranger Tom Mitchell transferred to a different section of Yellowstone in 1995, partly because walking past cabin 127 every day had become too difficult for him. "You start to question your own sanity," he explained to me. "I'd worked hundreds of missing persons cases, but this one, it violated everything I understood about how people disappear. There should have been something. There's always something." The Carter's blue Chevy Suburban was eventually released to David Carter, who drove it back to Philadelphia and parked it in his garage. He couldn't bring himself to sell it or donate it. "Sometimes I sit in it and try to imagine what they were thinking during their last drive," he told me. "I go through the glove compartment and find Sarah's gum, Michael's sunglasses, Emma's hair ties. It's like they just stepped out for a minute and they'll be back any second." In 1997, 4 years after the disappearance, Yellowstone implemented new safety protocols, partly in response to the Carter case. Families staying in remote cabins were encouraged to check in with rangers daily during extended stays. Additional security cameras were installed around popular areas, and staff training was updated to recognize signs that might indicate when visitors were planning activities that could put them at risk. But the changes felt inadequate given the mystery of what had happened to the Carters. How do you prevent something when you don't understand what caused it in the first place? The new protocols were designed to catch normal problems, people getting lost on hikes, medical emergencies, equipment failures. They weren't designed to address whatever had happened to a family that vanished from inside their locked cabin. The case began to fade from public attention as newer tragedies and mysteries captured media interest. Occasional articles would appear on the anniversary of their disappearance, but even those became less frequent over time. The internet was still in its infancy in the mid-1990s, so the kind of sustained online investigation that might happen today wasn't possible then. For David Carter and Sarah's sister Linda, the not knowing was the worst part. When someone dies, you grieve and eventually learn to move forward, Linda told me. When someone disappears like this, you're stuck. You can't grieve because they might still be alive. You can't move on because they might come back. You exist in this horrible limbo where hope and despair fight each other every single day. By 1999, 6 years after the disappearance, the case had largely moved into the cold files. It wasn't officially closed. It never could be without some resolution. But active investigation had essentially stopped. That would all change in 2003, when a routine maintenance operation would uncover something that brought the Carter family case screaming back into the spotlight. July 12, 2003. Exactly 10 years and 3 days after the Carter family disappeared, Park Ranger Jessica Williams was conducting a routine inspection of aging infrastructure near the Old Faithful area. The Park Service was updating water lines and electrical systems, work that required access to utility tunnels and maintenance areas that the public never sees. Jessica had been with Yellowstone for only 2 years, so she knew about the Carter case mainly through stories told by more experienced rangers. She'd heard that a family had vanished mysteriously in the 1990s, but she didn't know the details. Her focus that day was purely practical, checking pipe joints and electrical connections in the underground utility corridor that ran beneath several cabin clusters, including the area where cabin 127 was located. The utility tunnel was narrow, poorly lit, and not designed for extended human occupation. Jessica had to crawl through sections of it, using a flashlight to examine the infrastructure. The work was tedious and uncomfortable, but necessary to ensure the system's integrity. She'd been underground for about 2 hours when she reached a section where the tunnel widened slightly, near an electrical junction box. That's when she saw it. Wedged behind a bundle of pipes, covered in a decade's worth of dust and debris, was something that didn't belong in a utility tunnel, something pink and fuzzy that made her heart stop when she realized what it was. A small teddy bear, faded and dirty, but unmistakably a child's toy. Jessica carefully extracted the teddy bear from its hiding place. Even covered in grime, she could see that it had once been bright pink. One of its button eyes was missing, and its fur was matted, but it was clearly a beloved toy that had been carried by a child. As she examined it more closely, she noticed something that made her hands shake. Stitched into the bear's left foot in faded blue thread were the letters EC. Within an hour, Jessica had contacted her supervisor, who immediately called the park's chief ranger. The teddy bear was carefully photographed in place before being removed for analysis. Senior staff members who had worked the Carter case were contacted, including Tom Mitchell, who had since retired but drove back to Yellowstone the same day he heard the news. "The moment I saw it, I knew," Mitchell told me. "I remembered that little girl carrying that pink teddy bear everywhere. She called it Mr. Buttons. The initials EC, Emma Carter, were embroidered by her grandmother as a Christmas gift. This was definitely Emma's bear." The discovery raised immediate and disturbing questions. How had Emma Carter's teddy bear ended up in a utility tunnel beneath the ground? The tunnel was accessible only through locked maintenance hatches that required special tools to open. The area where the bear was found was directly beneath the cabin cluster where the Carters had stayed, but it would have been impossible for a child to reach that location without help. The discovery of Mr. Buttons sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and brought the Carter case back into the national spotlight. FBI investigators who had worked the original case returned to Yellowstone, armed with 10 years of technological advances and fresh perspective on what had become one of the park's most baffling unsolved mysteries. The teddy bear was subjected to extensive forensic analysis. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already suspected. The bear belonged to Emma Carter. More importantly, forensic experts were able to determine approximately how long the bear had been in the tunnel. Based on the degradation patterns of the fabric, the accumulation of dust and debris, and the condition of the stitching, they estimated that Mr. Buttons had been in that location for approximately 10 years. This timing was crucial. It meant the bear had likely been placed in the tunnel around the time of the family's disappearance, not years later. But how? The utility tunnel system had detailed maintenance records going back decades. No work had been scheduled in that section during July 1993. The tunnel had been inspected just 3 months before the Carter family's arrival, and Mr. Buttons had definitely not been there at that time. Investigators began mapping the entire tunnel system, looking for any possible way the teddy bear could have ended up in its location. What they discovered was deeply troubling. The tunnel where Mr. Buttons was found connected to a larger network that ran beneath most of the Old Faithful developed area. There were access points from several buildings, including maintenance sheds, utility buildings, and even a few older structures that had been built when safety protocols were less stringent. One access point particularly caught their attention: a maintenance hatch located in the basement of the Old Faithful Inn, just 200 yards from cabin 127. The hatch was supposed to be locked at all times, but when investigators checked it in 2003, they found that the lock mechanism was old and could be opened with basic tools. More disturbing, the basement area where the hatch was located was accessible to anyone who knew the building's layout and was willing to venture into unauthorized areas. The investigation expanded to examine anyone who had access to the tunnel system in 1993. This included park maintenance workers, contractors, and employees of the various concession companies that operated hotels and restaurants in the park. The list was longer than anyone had expected. Over 40 people had either direct access or could reasonably have obtained access to the tunnel system. Background checks were conducted on everyone on the list. Most were ruled out quickly due to solid alibis or clear evidence that they had no connection to the Carter family. But a few names raised red flags. 3 individuals who had worked in the area in 1993 had since been arrested for various crimes. One had a history of burglary, another had been convicted of assault, and the third had been arrested for stalking in 1998. None of these criminal histories proved any connection to the Carter disappearance, but they demonstrated that potentially dangerous individuals had been working in the park with access to areas where tourists stayed. This realization prompted a comprehensive review of the Park Service's employee screening procedures and raised uncomfortable questions about how thoroughly background checks had been conducted in the early 1990s. The discovery of Mr. Buttons also led investigators to re-examine the original crime scene with fresh eyes and new technology. In 1993, DNA analysis was in its infancy, and many forensic techniques that were standard by 2003 simply hadn't existed. Cabin 127 was taken out of service again, and forensic teams processed it using luminol testing, advanced fingerprint techniques, and trace evidence collection methods that had been developed over the intervening decade. What they found was both encouraging and frustrating. The improved techniques revealed evidence that had been missed in 1993. Additional fingerprints, traces of DNA from multiple individuals, and even microscopic fibers that could potentially be matched to clothing or other materials. Unfortunately, most of this evidence was contaminated by the hundreds of people who had stayed in the cabin over the 10 years since the Carter family's disappearance. However, one piece of evidence stood out. Hidden beneath the cabin's kitchen table, in a spot that would have been nearly impossible for housekeeping to reach during routine cleaning, investigators found a small piece of fabric. It was blue denim, about the size of a quarter, with one edge that appeared to have been torn rather than cut. The fabric showed signs of having been pulled forcefully from a larger garment. Microscopic analysis of the fabric revealed something significant. Embedded in the weave were traces of an unusual mineral composition that didn't match anything found naturally in the Yellowstone area. The minerals suggested contact with industrial materials or specialized equipment. This was the first physical evidence that something unusual had happened in Cabin 127, and it provided a potential lead for investigators to follow. The FBI began investigating companies and facilities within a 500-mile radius of Yellowstone that used the types of minerals found in the fabric sample. The list included mining operations, industrial plants, specialized laboratories, and even some military facilities. Cross-referencing these locations with individuals who had connections to Yellowstone and access to the park in 1993 became a massive undertaking. Meanwhile, the discovery of Mr. Buttons had reignited public interest in the case. Tips poured in from across the country as the story was featured on national television shows and early internet forums. Some tips were clearly from attention seekers or people with mental health issues, but others seemed potentially credible and required investigation. One tip that particularly caught investigators' attention came from a woman in Idaho who claimed her brother had worked in Yellowstone in 1993 and had acted strangely after the Carter family disappeared. According to the woman, her brother had suddenly quit his job at the park in late July 1993, despite having planned to work through the fall. He had returned home to Idaho, nervous and agitated, refusing to discuss his time at Yellowstone and becoming hostile when family members asked about his experiences there. The brother, Marcus Henley, had died in a car accident in 1999, so he couldn't be questioned directly. But investigators tracked down his former co-workers and began piecing together his employment history at Yellowstone. What they learned was disturbing. Henley had worked as a maintenance assistant with access to utility areas throughout the park. He had been assigned to the Old Faithful area during the summer of 1993, and his supervisor noted that he had called in sick for 3 days in mid-July, coinciding exactly with the Carter family's disappearance. The investigation into Marcus Henley revealed a pattern of troubling behavior that had gone unnoticed in 1993. Co-workers described him as a loner who often worked late shifts and seemed to know his way around the park's infrastructure better than most employees. He had been seen in areas where he wasn't supposed to be, and he had shown an unusual interest in the guests staying in various cabins, particularly families with young children. Investigators obtained a warrant to search Henley's former residence in Idaho, which was now owned by his sister. In the basement, they found a collection of park memorabilia that went far beyond normal employee keepsakes. Henley had kept detailed maps of Yellowstone's utility systems, including hand-drawn diagrams that showed access points not included in official park service documents. He had photographs of various cabin areas taken from unusual angles, suggesting surveillance activity. Most disturbing of all, they found a small wooden box containing what appeared to be souvenirs. Inside were items that clearly belonged to park visitors: a child's hair clip, a woman's earring, a man's pen, and several other small personal objects. None of these items could be directly connected to the Carter family, but their presence suggested that Henley had been taking trophies from tourists for an unknown period of time. The box also contained photographs. Most showed normal park scenes, but several appeared to have been taken covertly of families staying in various cabins. The photos were taken from positions that would have required access to restricted areas or the use of specialized equipment. In 3 of the photographs, investigators could clearly see families through cabin windows, including parents and children in various states of undress, suggesting that Henley had been engaging in voyeuristic behavior. These discoveries painted a picture of an individual who had been using his position as a park employee to gain access to tourists' private spaces and personal belongings. The question remained: had Henley's activities escalated from voyeurism and petty theft to something far more serious? And if so, what had happened to the Carter family? A review of Henley's personnel file revealed additional red flags that should have been caught during the hiring process. His previous employer had noted concerns about his reliability and his tendency to show up in areas where he wasn't supposed to be. A former landlord had complained about him accessing utility areas of apartment buildings without permission. These warning signs had been overlooked when he was hired by the Park Service, partly due to staff shortages and the difficulty of finding seasonal workers willing to live in remote areas. The investigation also revealed gaps in the park's security procedures that could have allowed someone like Henley to move freely throughout restricted areas. In 1993, many utility tunnels and maintenance areas weren't monitored or secured as carefully as they would be in later years. An employee with Henley's access could potentially enter tourist areas after hours without being detected. But even with all this circumstantial evidence pointing toward Henley as a person of interest, investigators still faced the fundamental question that had plagued the case from the beginning: what had actually happened to the Carter family? There was no evidence of violence in cabin 127, no indication of where the bodies might be, and no clear explanation for how 4 people could have been removed from the cabin without leaving any trace. Indeed, as the investigation into Marcus Henley continued through 2004 and 2005, investigators developed several theories about what might have happened to the Carter family, but none could be definitively proven. The most likely scenario involved Henley using his access to approach the family under the pretense of official park business, then somehow overpowering them and removing them from the cabin through the utility tunnel system. Ground-penetrating radar was used to scan areas near the tunnel network where bodies might have been buried. Several anomalies were detected and excavated, but none revealed human remains. Investigators theorized that Henley might have used his knowledge of the park's geothermal features to dispose of evidence, as the high temperatures and acidic conditions in many hot springs would destroy organic material completely. The piece of denim fabric found in cabin 127 was eventually matched to fibers found in Henley's work clothes, providing the first direct physical link between him and the crime scene. However, as a maintenance worker, Henley would have had legitimate reasons for being in and around the cabin area, so even this evidence wasn't conclusive proof of wrongdoing. In 2006, 13 years after the disappearance, the FBI officially named Marcus Henley as the primary suspect in the Carter family case. However, since Henley had died in 1999, he could never be prosecuted, and many questions remained unanswered. The case was reclassified as administratively closed, meaning that investigators believed they had identified the perpetrator but couldn't provide absolute proof or recover the victim's remains. David Carter and Linda, Sarah's sister, finally had some answers, but the resolution felt incomplete. "Knowing who probably did it helps," David told me, "but not knowing what happened to them, not being able to lay them to rest properly, that part never gets easier. Emma would be 18 now. Tommy would be 16. I think about them every day." The discovery of Mr. Buttons had provided the break investigators needed to identify a suspect, but it had also raised new questions. Why had Emma's teddy bear been left in the tunnel? Was it dropped during a struggle? Was it placed there deliberately as some kind of message? Had other evidence been hidden in the park's vast underground infrastructure? To this day, periodic searches are conducted in areas that Henley had access to, hoping to find the Carter family's remains or additional evidence. The case remains technically open, and park rangers are still trained to watch for any signs that might be connected to the disappearance. Emma's teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, sits in an FBI evidence room, a silent witness to one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The Carter family cabin number 127 is still in use today, though many guests don't know its dark history. The Old Faithful area continues to welcome hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, most of whom never learn about the family that vanished there in 1993. But for those who knew the Carters, and for the investigators who worked their case, the questions linger. What really happened during those final hours in cabin 127? How did a family of 4 simply vanish without a trace? And somewhere in Yellowstone's vast wilderness, do the answers still wait to be discovered? What do you think really happened to the Carter family? Do you believe Marcus Henley was responsible, or is there another explanation for their disappearance? Share your theories in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more true crime mysteries that will keep you awake at night. The years following the identification of Marcus Henley as the primary suspect brought both closure and new torment for the Carter family's loved ones. In 2007, David Carter made the difficult decision to have his brother's family declared legally dead, allowing him to settle their estate and create memorial funds in their names. But even with this legal closure, the absence of physical remains meant that grief could never fully complete its natural cycle. I spent considerable time investigating Henley's background beyond his employment at Yellowstone, and what I discovered painted a picture of a man whose criminal behavior likely extended far beyond the Carter case. Records from his childhood in rural Montana showed a pattern of disturbing incidents. At age 12, he'd been suspected of killing neighborhood pets, though charges were never filed. During high school, several female classmates reported that he had followed them home from school, but again, no formal action was taken. Henley's employment history revealed a nomadic pattern that should have raised red flags. Between 1985 and 1993, he had worked at 6 different national parks and recreation areas across the western United States. Each job lasted between 6 months and 2 years, and in most cases he had left under circumstances that his supervisors described as unusual or concerning. A former supervisor at Grand Canyon National Park told me that Henley had been caught accessing employee housing areas where he wasn't authorized to be, claiming he was checking on maintenance issues. Most disturbing was information I uncovered about Henley's time at Olympic National Park in Washington state during the summer of 1991. A family of 3, parents and their 7-year-old daughter, had gone missing during a camping trip, but their case had received far less attention than the Carter disappearance. The family's campsite was found with all their belongings intact, including the father's wallet and the mother's jewelry. Their car was still locked in the parking area, and search teams found no trace of their departure route. The Olympic case had been classified as a probable hiking accident, with the assumption that the family had become lost in the wilderness and succumbed to exposure. But when I cross-referenced the dates with Henley's employment records, I discovered that he had been working in the same area of the park when the family disappeared. More significantly, he had requested several days off immediately following their disappearance, claiming a family emergency that his supervisor later learned was fabricated. I contacted the lead investigator from the Olympic case, retired Detective Sarah Thompson, who agreed to review the evidence in light of the Henley connection. What she found was eerily similar to the Carter case. No physical evidence of the family's departure from their campsite, no disturbance of the surrounding vegetation, and no logical explanation for how three people could simply vanish. The family's 7-year-old daughter had been carrying a small, stuffed animal, a blue elephant, that was never found. Detective Thompson and I began collaborating to identify other missing persons cases that correlated with Henley's employment history. What emerged was a potential pattern of disappearances spanning nearly a decade across multiple states. Not all of the cases fit the profile. Some missing persons from parks where Henley worked were eventually found or had clear explanations for their disappearance. But at least 4 cases showed similarities that were too significant to ignore. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its consistency. Henley targeted families with young children who were staying in remote or isolated accommodations within national parks. The disappearances always occurred during his employment period at each location. In every case, the missing person's belongings were left behind intact, suggesting they had not planned to leave voluntarily, and in each case, despite extensive search efforts, no trace of the missing individuals was ever found. Armed with this new information, I approached the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to develop a psychological profile of Marcus Henley and to assess the likelihood that he was responsible for multiple disappearances across the national park system. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez, who specializes in serial predator cases, agreed to review the evidence and provide her professional assessment. Agent Martinez's analysis was deeply disturbing. According to her evaluation, Henley exhibited characteristics consistent with what behavioral analysts call a mission-oriented serial killer, someone who believes they are justified in their actions by some perceived higher purpose or calling. In Henley's case, his intimate knowledge of park systems and his apparent ability to make families disappear without a trace suggested he viewed himself as some kind of guardian or controller of the wilderness areas where he worked. The agent's profile indicated that Henley likely began with voyeuristic behavior, using his maintenance access to spy on park visitors in their private moments. This behavior would have escalated over time, potentially progressing to entering occupied cabins or campsites while families slept. The collection of personal items found in his basement supported this theory. They were trophies that allowed him to relive his invasions of privacy long after the incidents occurred. But Agent Martinez believed that Henley's crimes had evolved beyond voyeurism. The pattern of family disappearances suggested someone who had developed both the psychological need and the practical capability to make people vanish completely. His knowledge of park infrastructure, including utility tunnels, maintenance areas, and remote locations, would have given him advantages that typical predators don't possess. The psychological profile also addressed why Henley might have targeted families rather than individuals. Agent Martinez theorized that he was motivated by a desire to control and dominate what he perceived as intruders in his wilderness. Families with children represented the ultimate symbol of outsiders who didn't understand or respect the natural world the way he believed they should. By making them disappear, He was asserting his authority over the landscape he saw as his domain. This analysis led to a renewed investigation of several cold cases that hadn't previously been connected to Henley. Using the FBI's VICAP database, investigators identified 17 additional missing persons cases from national parks and recreation areas across the western United States between 1985 and 1999. While not all of these cases showed clear connections to Henley, 7 exhibited enough similarities to warrant further investigation. The scope of the potential crimes was staggering. If the profile was accurate, Henley might have been responsible for the disappearances of more than 30 people over a 14-year period. The victims would have included couples, families, and even solo travelers who had the misfortune of crossing paths with a predator who knew exactly how to make them vanish without a trace in some of America's most beautiful and remote locations. One case that particularly caught my attention occurred at Glacier National Park in Montana during the summer of 1989. A young couple from Canada had disappeared while on their honeymoon, leaving behind a campsite that showed no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Henley had been working as a seasonal maintenance employee at Glacier that summer, and employment records showed he had been assigned to the area where the couple was last seen. As word of the expanded investigation spread through law enforcement circles, families of other missing persons began reaching out with their own stories. Each phone call brought new heartbreak and new questions about how many people Marcus Henley might have harmed during his years working in America's national parks. One call that particularly affected me came from Margaret Walsh, whose daughter and son-in-law had disappeared at Zion National Park in Utah in 1992. Lisa and James Hendricks had been experienced hikers who had planned a 3-day backpacking trip in the park's wilderness area. They had obtained proper permits, filed a detailed itinerary with park rangers, and carried appropriate safety equipment, including GPS devices and emergency beacons. When the couple failed to return as scheduled, search and rescue teams found their campsite on the second night of their planned trip. Their tent was properly set up, their food was stored correctly in bear canisters, and their hiking gear was organized as if they had been preparing for bed. But Lisa and James were nowhere to be found. Most puzzling, their emergency beacon was still in the tent, fully functional but never activated. Margaret told me that what haunted her most was the lack of any logical explanation. Lisa was a nurse and James was a firefighter, she said. They were both trained in emergency procedures. If they had encountered any kind of trouble, a medical emergency, equipment failure, even an animal attack, they knew exactly what to do. They would have used their emergency beacon. They would have left some kind of sign for rescuers. The fact that they didn't suggests something happened so quickly that they couldn't respond. Indeed, when I cross-referenced the dates of Lisa and James's disappearance with employment records, I discovered that Marcus Henley had been working at Zion National Park as a trail maintenance specialist during the exact period when they vanished. His work assignment included the wilderness area where their campsite was found, and he would have known the trail system well enough to intercept hikers without being detected by other park visitors or staff. The Zion case introduced a new element to the pattern I was tracking. Unlike the Carter family and other victims who had disappeared from developed areas within parks, Lisa and James had vanished from a remote wilderness location. This suggested that Henley's methods had evolved to allow him to target people even in areas where he couldn't rely on building infrastructure or utility access to conceal his activities. I began working with wilderness survival experts to understand how someone with Henley's knowledge and experience could approach hikers in remote areas without being detected. What I learned was that a person familiar with trail systems and terrain could easily observe and follow other hikers while remaining hidden. Someone with Henley's maintenance background would know locations of emergency shelters, supply caches, and communication equipment that could be used to facilitate crimes or dispose of evidence. The wilderness expert I consulted, former park ranger Mark Rodriguez, painted a chilling picture of how such crimes might be committed. Someone with maintenance access could pre-position equipment or supplies in remote areas, Rodriguez explained. They could identify locations where people commonly camp and set up observation points. They could even sabotage trail markers or emergency equipment to increase the likelihood that hikers would become lost or confused, making them easier targets. This information led to a disturbing realization about the scope of Henley's potential crimes. If he had been targeting people in both developed and wilderness areas of national parks, the number of possible victims could be much higher than initially estimated. Many hikers who disappear in wilderness areas are assumed to have died from natural causes: exposure, falls, animal attacks, or getting lost. Or, if some of these disappearances were actually homicides, they would represent nearly perfect crimes committed in locations where evidence could be easily concealed or destroyed by natural processes. By 2008, 15 years after the Carter family's disappearance, the investigation had evolved into one of the largest serial killer cases in National Park Service history. A joint task force was established, including FBI agents, Park Service investigators, and local law enforcement from multiple states. The task force's mission was to identify all possible victims of Marcus Henley and to determine whether other suspects might be involved in similar crimes. The task force's work revealed disturbing gaps in communication and record-keeping that had allowed patterns like Henley's to go undetected for years. In the 1980s and 1990s, missing persons reports from different parks were handled independently with limited coordination between jurisdictions. A person who disappeared at Yellowstone might never be connected to someone who vanished at Glacier, even if both cases had similar characteristics. One of the task force's most significant discoveries came from analyzing employment records across the entire National Park Service system. They found that Henley wasn't the only seasonal employee who had worked at multiple parks where disappearances occurred. At least 3 other individuals showed employment patterns that correlated with missing persons cases, suggesting that the problem might extend beyond a single predator. This revelation led to the creation of new protocols for screening and monitoring Park Service employees. Background checks were enhanced to include more detailed criminal history searches and psychological evaluations. A database was established to track the movement of seasonal employees between different parks, and reporting procedures were implemented to flag unusual patterns of disappearances that might indicate criminal activity. The emotional toll of the investigation was enormous for everyone involved. Task force members regularly dealt with families who'd been waiting years or even decades for answers about their missing loved ones. Each new piece of evidence brought hope to some families while destroying the last hopes of others. The weight of potentially dozens of unsolved murders created an atmosphere of urgency and determination that drove investigators to work exhaustively despite limited resources. David Carter became an informal spokesman for the families of Henley's suspected victims. He organized support groups, advocated for legislative changes to improve park security, and worked with media outlets to keep attention focused on the cases. These weren't just statistics, he told me. Each missing person was someone's child, parent, spouse, or sibling. The families deserved to know what happened, and the victims deserve justice, even if their killer is already dead. Udry, one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the investigation was the discovery of additional children's items in locations where Henley had worked. At Bryce Canyon National Park, investigators found a small toy car buried beneath a maintenance shed that Henley had been assigned to repair in 1990. The car was traced to a 5-year-old boy who had disappeared with his parents during a camping trip that summer. At Rocky Mountain National Park, a child's hair ribbon was discovered in a utility box that only maintenance personnel could access. These discoveries provided additional evidence linking Henley to multiple disappearances, but they also raised agonizing questions for the victims' families. Why had these items been kept? Were they trophies that Henley used to relive his crimes? Had the children lost them during struggles, or had they been deliberately taken as souvenirs? The psychological implications were almost too terrible to contemplate. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that the full scope of Henley's crimes might never be known. His death in 1999 had eliminated the possibility of obtaining a confession or learning the locations where victims' remains might be hidden. Vast areas of wilderness in multiple states would need to be searched to potentially recover physical evidence, a task that could take decades and cost millions of dollars with no guarantee of success. In 2010, 17 years after the Carter family's disappearance, I received a phone call that would add yet another layer of complexity to the case. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Colorado, contacted me about some unusual findings she had made while researching historical missing persons cases in the American West. Dr. Vasquez had been studying patterns of disappearances in wilderness areas dating back to the early 1900s, trying to understand whether modern search and rescue techniques had improved survival rates for lost hikers. During her research, she had noticed that certain national parks showed unusually high numbers of unexplained disappearances during specific time periods, even accounting for increased visitation and recreational activity. What made her findings particularly intriguing was that these disappearance clusters often correlated with the presence of individual employees who worked at multiple parks during their careers. Marcus Henley was one of several people whose employment history matched suspicious patterns, but he wasn't the only one. Dr. Vasquez had identified at least 6 other individuals whose work assignments coincided with unusual numbers of missing persons reports. The statistical probability of these correlations occurring by chance is virtually zero, Dr. Vasquez explained to me. We're looking at evidence of systematic predatory behavior spanning decades, possibly involving multiple perpetrators who may have operated independently or even in coordination with each other. This revelation suggested that the Carter family case might be part of a much larger criminal conspiracy that had operated within America's national park system for generations. The idea that trusted employees with intimate knowledge of park operations might have been using their positions to harm visitors challenged fundamental assumptions about the safety and security of these public lands. Dr. Vasquez's research led to the establishment of the National Park Missing Persons Database, a comprehensive system for tracking and analyzing disappearances across all federal recreational lands. The database was designed to identify patterns that might indicate criminal activity and to ensure that suspicious cases received appropriate investigative attention. As of 2024, the database contains records of more than 1,200 unexplained disappearances dating back to 1950. The database's creation also prompted Congress to hold hearings on safety and security in national parks. Families of missing persons, including David Carter, testified about the inadequate response to their cases and the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies. The hearings resulted in new legislation requiring enhanced background checks for park employees and improved training for investigating missing persons cases in wilderness environments. Meanwhile, the search for answers about the Carter family's fate continued. In 2015, ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies beneath a maintenance building at Yellowstone that had been under construction during Henley's employment there. Excavation revealed a hidden room that appeared to have been used as some kind of storage area, but no human remains were found. However, investigators did discover additional personal items that belonged to various missing persons, including a wedding ring that was traced to Lisa Hendricks, the nurse who had disappeared at Zion National Park in 1992. The discovery of the hidden room provided the strongest physical evidence yet that Henley had been collecting trophies from his victims. The room contained detailed maps of multiple national parks with locations marked in red ink, handwritten journals describing surveillance activities, and photographs of families taken without their knowledge. The journals included coded references that investigators believe correspond to various disappearances, but the code has never been successfully deciphered. As I conclude this investigation in 2024, 31 years after the Carter family disappeared, many questions remain unanswered. The task force continues to investigate potential connections between Marcus Henley and dozens of missing persons cases. New evidence is still being analyzed, and families continue to hope for resolution. The case has fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches missing persons investigations in wilderness areas and has led to significant improvements in park security protocols. Emma Carter would be 39 years old today. Tommy would be 37. Their parents, Michael and Sarah, would be in their early 60s. For David Carter, now in his 70s, the passage of time has brought acceptance, but not peace. "I know my brother's family is gone," he told me recently. "I know someone evil took them away. But until we find them, until we can lay them to rest properly, part of me will always be waiting for them to come home." The pink teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, remains in FBI custody as evidence in an ongoing investigation. It serves as a reminder that even in death, Marcus Henley continues to guard his secrets. Somewhere in America's vast wilderness, the answers to one of our most haunting mysteries may still be waiting to be discovered. What do you think really happened to the Carter family? Do you believe Marcus Henley was responsible, or is there another explanation for their disappearance? Share your theories in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more true crime mysteries that will keep you awake at night.